So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, whether you're listening, tuning in live, or whether you're listening to the recording, we welcome you. As I said, my name is Aisling Clardy. I work at the UNESCO Chair in Inclusive Physical Education, Sport, Recreation and Fitness at the Munster Technological University in Ireland. And we are running the series of webinars on behalf of UNESCO's International Center of Martial Arts for Youth Development and Engagement in South Korea. I'm aware that some of you are participating in UNESCO ICM's Martial Arts Research Initiative for Experts program, the MARI program, and others are joining because you're a martial arts coach or enthusiast. And wherever you are on that spectrum, you're warmly welcome. And to this webinar number 1 of this series. And at the end of the session, I'll share a little bit more about the full series and where you can get more information to register. So as you may be aware, for children and adults with disabilities, martial arts and sports in general can help build relationships in school, in the community, through physical education and sport, and for benefit of both or all parties for an inclusive society. And one of the primary barriers to inclusive practice is insufficient training. And in today's webinar, we'll be sharing and exploring some principles of adapted physical activity and universal design for learning, and how these principles can guide inclusive practice. And so we have some very special panelists today who will speak on these topics, and I'll introduce you to both of them, and then I'll hand you over to them and they'll speak more on their topics. And then we'll move into some rich conversation and discussion. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Yumi Kim, soon to be Dr. Yumi Kim. She's from South Korea, living in the USA, and Yumi holds a master's level black belt in Taekwondo, and she has many years of experience in teaching both individuals with and without disabilities. Yumi has published many research articles, including the effects of adapted martial arts, and she's currently finishing her PhD in rehabilitation science under the renowned Dr. James Rimmer at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, and as well as working as a researcher at the Lakeshore Foundation. And she has a postdoctoral position lined up, which she'll be starting very soon once she finishes her PhD. And Yumi's research interests focus on exercise and physical activity promotion for people with disabilities through more targeted intervention contexts and implementation strategies. And we also have Nick Hoekstra. I'm delighted to introduce you to Nick. He's a martial artist with a black belt in Judo, a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and he spent a significant amount of time in Japan and Chile practicing various martial arts. He's worked with the UNESCO Chair and UNESCO's ICM in South Korea. And Nick has been fully blind since the age of 7. And on top of that, his primary work and research focuses on strategies for promoting inclusive education, in particular in low-income and low-resource contexts. This includes the production and distribution of books in accessible formats, class-wide methods for inclusive education. And over the last 10 years, he's worked with both governments and international organizations developing or managing projects in over 20 developing or least developed countries around the world in Africa, Asia, and South America. And Nick is currently completing his PhD in special education at the University of Kansas. And so first I'll hand it over to Yumi, and Yumi is going to share with us some of the guiding general principles from the field of adapted physical activity.
Thank you for the great introduction, Aisling. And also thank you all for your interest and being here today to talk about adapted martial art program for people with disabilities. Oops. So first, I would like to give you a brief overview of the field of adapted physical activity. I believe it will help us understand where inclusive adaptive martial art would fall under the concept of APA. So please look at the figure. The top of triangle represents that APA is a broad umbrella term that includes both adaptive fitness and adapted physical educations. So on the left side, adapted fitness is also called as adapted therapeutic exercise because this field mainly focus on exercise as a therapeutic and rehabilitation approach. Adaptive fitness includes adaptive sports like a Special Olympic, Paralympic, as well as recreational activities like horseback riding or swimming. I believe that the adaptive martial art actually fall under this adapted sports and recreational activities, considering that the modern form of martial art became more than just fight and self-defense activity. Another branch of adapted physical activity on the right side is adaptive physical education. This is mainly for children with disabilities before and within the school setting. So let's look at the adaptive fitness more closely. I would like to first point that the word adapted, modified, accommodating, the meanings are very similar and these are interchangeably used in the field. So the definition of adapted fitness is individually designed and modified exercise for people with special needs, whether they have impairment, functional limitations, or disability. The main goal of adapted fitness is to achieve optimal motor functions and independence of activities of daily living, and also to prevent dysfunctions and secondary complications. So for example, people with multiple sclerosis, which is a neurodegenerative disease, they commonly experience walking dysfunction and other symptomatic fatigues over the progression of disease. Then one of the goals of adaptive fitness for people with multiple sclerosis is to walk safely, longer duration, with or without assistive device. Further, this can help he or she have a grocery shopping safely around many people independently and take less stops or break in a big market, maybe Costco, which is a huge market. Another example is for people with a spinal cord injury who uses a wheelchair as a main form of transportation in many cases. Then one of the goals of adaptive fitness for people with a spinal cord injury is to transfer them and their body safely from one seat to another, perhaps chair to bed, chair to car, or chair to toilet. So he or she can achieve independence to carry their daily activities at home or outside of home independently. Further, this can help other secondary complications like a pressure sore. Um, the pressure sore is a condition that the area of the skin is damaged because they are staying in the same position for too long, like sitting in the wheelchair. And most importantly, we work with our client, people with the disabilities, this case, to achieve these fitness goals through the 5 basic component of fitness. Okay, so these lists are showing the 5 basic component of adapted fitness. range of motion, muscle strength and endurance, cardiovascular endurance, balance and proprioception, and functional movement, like walking, body awareness, and manipulations. And this actually includes like some sports skills like throwing, catching, striking, hitting, and etc. So going back to the figure that we saw in the first slide, which is also on the right side of the slide, these basic fitness component can further help people to practice and perform adapted sports or other recreational activities in better form. If we apply the example of martial art to this concept, the basic fitness will help people to perform kick, punch, or turn safely, faster, stronger, and perhaps longer period. So the basic concept of the APA is until this point. And let's move to the question that we prepared. So what are the common challenges to adaptive martial art? And before me just talking, I would love to hear the participants here, the participants in this webinar's examples that they have experienced or they can think of. Just one or two would be good. How can we see the chat?
So Yumi, I can see the chat. So if any of the participants would like to share your experiences in response to Yumi's question into the chat, and we can I can call them out. So can you just say the question again one more time, Yumi?
So what are the common challenges to adaptive martial art is our discussion topic. And if anyone has some experience that you had people with a disability as your student or participants in the studio in the practice, like, did you have any experience with that?
So we have a couple of comments coming in. So I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Yumi Kim has commented, excuse me if I got the name incorrectly. She said that they said, I taught the adapted martial arts and some of them are people with autism. They couldn't focus on the class. It was hard to conduct well in the class. Do you have any suggestions for people with autism?
Sounds great.
And we have another comment as well after, so we can get to that one too.
No, please. Yeah, please give all. Yeah.
Oh, will I move on to the next one or do you want to address that one? Okay. And so Andrei Vorontsov said, there are a lot of challenges for people with disabilities. However, from my experience is the lack of motivation, especially in the case of injuries. How do we generate motivation?
Do we have another?
Yeah. That's it for now. Yeah. So if another one comes in, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I'll go back to the first one and then touch for the children with autism first. So I'm really glad that, sorry, I forgot the name, but someone shared it. So let me introduce my master's thesis project that I had so much fun before. And I delivered adapted martial art program for children with autism. It was 8 weeks Taekwondo program and aimed to improve their balance and participation. I actually had the same experience that their attention span is so short and the verbal instruction is very challenging for these children. the things that I tried for them is, of course, getting so much help with the research assistant that I had luckily at that time. So probably one per one children, one instructor per children, and or sometimes like one instructor per two children, depends on their engagement level. I had that many helps to engage them into the program. Also, like I realized that the key of the program for this individual is always clear and concise cue. And we really simplify the activities and games before and after the actual practice of the martial art. And I had a lot of communications with parents and guardians to make sure what they like, what they don't like, if they have any behavior issues, uh, what is the way that I can deal with it? If is there anything that they love or they are so into, so I can actually engage that movement into the program so they can find the interest and try to learn more things about the program, the martial art. A lot of adapted tool was actually implemented for children with autism into the practice. So if we have some kind of ball game, of course, these balls has replaced with some larger, lighter balls, so they can play with it safely. It was hard to teach them how to use the kicking and punching pad correctly with the correct form so they don't get injured. So rather than using the typical the kicking and punching pad that we have, we ended up implementing the X-ray film. Please help me, Aisling. We talked about this. So the X-ray film that the doctors like put it up to the slide when you go to doctor's office.
Yeah.
That is a very thin plastic and it's very floppy. And when you hit it, it actually makes a really big sound. So we used that X-ray film like a punching and kicking pad. So once they hit it, they make a very big sound and be excited with that. Of course, it's a different case for children with autism who's sensitive with the big sound, but luckily I didn't have anyone who has problem with that.
And can I come in there, Yumi, just to say, because I think that's a very important point, and you too, feel free to come in as well, Nick, at any time. I think it really is such an individual, every person is individual and unique, and to remember that we can have guidelines and recommendations, and they're different for each person. And I know in my own experience as well, working with people with autism, sometimes visual cues are a great support. You know, if you are providing verbal instruction, to keep it really simple, but actually what often is more beneficial is to give them visual cues, like you can laminate some cue cards with images and show them, and keeping that structure. I know it's common practice to create a board, you know, have some sort of board where you can stick the laminated images on with Velcro and help, you know, let them choose as well, to help, you know, help them be empowered within the session, but also to have a structure. So you have a warm up, you know, for example, if you have in your warm up session, here are some activities they can put in there and they can stick onto the board themselves. And another strategy to come works very well as well with motivating people with autism is the first then. So first we'll do, you know, get them into the habit of, okay, first we're going to do this activity that's on task, and then we'll spend a minute or two doing a more fun activity. So they get into the habit of, you know, they get into this pattern or this structure of first we'll do this, then there'll be a sort of reward activity or such following.
Thank you. Shall we move to the next question? So lack of motivation. Let's see. Oh,
Can I come in with another? So Andre just added a little bit to his question. Yumi, just so to add, so it's the same question, the same topic. So he's saying a friend of his used to practice martial arts, but after a severe car accident, he's in a wheelchair and he doesn't want to be engaged with martial arts anymore, even though he knows it will benefit him and his general fitness. So the question is, how can we convince him to be more active and start practicing martial arts again? He knows that he won't be able to walk.
that is really great point. So it is hard to bring in people when they are not interested at all from the beginning. So we call that in the behavior theory, there is a multiple phases, and we call that as a pre-contemplation phase. So the individual is not really interested in to do so. That is hard. But once they come into the studio and into the practice, and if they are not motivated because they have the feeling that they are unable to achieve the movement, I think that's the point. That's the point where we can really intervene and help them to practice the movement without feeling that they are discriminated or excluded with a lot of movement, perhaps kicking for the person we just talked about. So yes, let's go back. Let's talk about the people who use the wheelchair as the main form of transportation. So the way how we practiced, at least in my specialty, in my martial art field, when we have kicking movement, we actually replace that movement with something else. For example, if they can lift their thigh in a sitting position, all the kicking timing was replaced with that small movement, which still can give a lot of benefits for them. If they don't have lower body movement at all, the timing of the kicking was actually replaced with bending their upper body. So do all the punching movement, but when others kick, they bend their upper body to the direction where the kick is going. If that is even not suitable, it was actually replaced with the arm lifting or the other punching movement. So if it is front kick, it was replaced with the uppercut. If it is a side kick, and replaced with a hook. Or it can be just replaced with the arm lifting toward the kicking directions. So here the key is, when we talked about adaptation, accommodation, it's always adaptation does not mean excluding the movement. Do something that can be replaced. So I think that replacement of movement, it doesn't look like exactly same as you may think, or the friends think that the movement that he's performing is not exactly same as he did before. But I think doing something and completing the one sequence of movement or two sequence of movement completely, we need to give them, they can do, we need to give the sense of feeling of achievement that they can do this, even though it is not exactly same what they saw or what they thought. Yeah. That confidence is really the key of the motivation and engagement, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just feel to share or add to that as well. I think it's so important what you said there about the confidence. Like if you think of somebody who was already engaging in martial arts and then they're in an accident, and they're in a wheelchair, that's a huge life event, and it can have a lot of there can be huge major adjustment or phase of adjustment there. So when you really think of the person and the difficulty, obviously there's some emotional and maybe even mental difficulty coming to terms with that. So of course it naturally may take time, and some people, depending on the person's personality, and how well you know the person, maybe having a conversation with them, a deep meaningful conversation, or empathic conversation, um, because it depends on how recent the accident was, but it does take time to adjust, and building their self, they would have had they may have had a high level of self-efficacy in terms of martial arts, and now they'll be coming to martial arts in a totally different space. They may still be getting used to being in their body as it is now, using a wheelchair, so there's that, and then coming back and having to relearn martial arts to a point. So yeah, feel free. Are you going to come in with something there, Nick?
Yeah, no, I was just going to mention that it's a case of knowing what your capabilities were prior to an accident versus kind of re-establishing what your capabilities are afterwards. And from what it sounds like, this might be a case of somebody who is viewing their current abilities in light of what they were previously able to do, which of course, when you're looking at something like the martial arts, which can be relatively competitive, depending on the martial art, that can be super frustrating. But it's a question of, I guess, changing your goals a little bit. And I mean, depending on what we're looking at, and this is something I'll talk about in my presentation as well, but it's really important to have a clear goal of what is your purpose for training the martial art, and that purpose may have shifted, and that might be something important to maybe to discuss with the friend, is that, well, why do we want you to be part of martial arts again? Well, it's good for you, it's good for your body, it's going to help you build better mobility, build better strength. So the goal has shifted a little bit, but I can completely understand that hesitation to come back to something when you have a prior expectation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just to keep us on line with the time, I'm just wondering, Nick, is this a very natural segue into your conversation around universal
Sure.
design for learning?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So whenever you're ready, you could share your presentation.
There we go. Let me know if you're seeing that.
Yes, I'm seeing it. It's all yours.
Fantastic. So again, I want to also reiterate and say thank you guys. Thank everyone out there for joining us, whether you're virtual or live today. Excuse me, whether you're watching us now or watching the recording. As a person with a disability and a practitioner of a martial art, I absolutely appreciate your interest in this topic. So I'm going to discuss Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. And to begin with, I just want to mention, so natural variability. So human variability is systematic, which means it's predictable to an extent. And what that basically means is that, look, we know that in any group of people, let's say in any population of individuals, 15% of those people will probably have some sort of disability. It's not always going to be obvious what that disability is. Not all disabilities are easily noticeable. And just beyond discussing disability, we have the natural variability that happens throughout the course of a lifetime, whether from people who are young, who are developing their motor skills, to people who are elderly and slowly adapting to a body that is changing and maybe losing a little bit of their motor functionality. So we have this natural range of disability that's predictable, natural range of functioning, which is predictable. That being said, retrofitting, adapting an established lesson, can be ineffectual in the sense of the time commitment. If you wait to encounter somebody who has a special need before you start to plan, you've already lost some time. So a lot of universal design for learning is about planning ahead. And with that in mind, universal design for learning, it's an educational framework designed to help instructors or coaches plan for that natural variability ahead of time. And we do so through three broad principles, the first of which being multiple means of representation. Consider how you provide information, communicate information in multiple ways. Providing multiple means of engagement, that is to say, offering individuals differing pathways to reaching their goals by drawing on their strengths and interests. We touched upon this a little bit earlier when we were talking about children or youth with autism, and how it's really important to draw upon their different interests to get them engaged. And finally, offering multiple means of action and expression, which is to say, how do learners express their understanding and express their learning? Okay, so who benefits from UDL? So UDL was inspired by universal design in architecture. And an example of universal design in action is curb cuts. So when the sidewalk has been cut to allow people with wheelchairs to more easily move from the sidewalk to the street, this is an innovation that also benefited people with strollers or pedestrians with suitcases. So in a similar sense, by considering the needs of individuals at either end of the spectrum, so individuals with athletes at one end of the spectrum, or an adult hobbyist at the other end of the spectrum. By creating an environment that is appropriate for both extremes of the spectrum, we can accommodate all the individual variability that falls in between. So by really designing and thinking to, how is your class, how is your lesson, how is your martial art going to meet the needs of an athlete who is, at the peak of their training, who is going to compete, versus somebody who is a hobbyist, somebody who's just interested in coming to practice for the community sense. When we design for those two extremes, we're going to meet the needs of everyone in between. So to give some examples of the principles of UDL, multiple means of representation. So it's important to consider how you teach. Make sure to demonstrate for people who may not be able to hear. Make sure to speak for people who may not be able to see. And make sure to use clear language for people who may not understand, who may be learning a second language, or may have a limited capacity for understanding. So, and these are just some examples. Obviously, this can go much broader, but also, make sure that materials are accessible to everyone. So we're talking about different weights of materials, different sizes of materials. Multiple means of engagement. So draw on the strengths and interests of your learners. For example, we can include information on when a technique might be useful in a real life situation. You can explain the history behind a practice. If it's more of a traditional, in air quotes, martial art, you can explain kind of the history behind it. You can define interesting vocab, all ways to kind of get people more interested in what they're doing. And ensure that no student is left out. So make sure that there's no student that's sitting to the edge that's not able to participate. And finally, multiple means of action and expression. How do students demonstrate their knowledge? So for example, if we're doing a martial art that has throws, can a student walk out of a throw? That is to say, rather than having a student who may have difficulties falling, I'm thinking in particular, if you have an elderly student who may not be prepared to fall, can a partner set up a throw and have the individual walk out of a throw? Can a student with limited mobility in one part of the body adapt a technique to use another part? This is something that I've personally worked with in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu with individuals who are lacking mobility in one arm had managed to adapt a technique to use their legs instead. And yeah, those are the examples for multiple means of action and expression. So planning with UDL. So a big part of UDL, as I said, is planning ahead of time. So thinking ahead to what you're going to be teaching. UDL begins with setting goals. So the goals are typically distinct for each individual, and it's really important, especially as a coach or as an instructor, to consider the goals for each individual, because that's going to help you determine the rest of their learning. So for example, for one individual, a goal might be to improve physical fitness. It might be to learn a specific kata, or it might be to get up to a level where they're a competitor. The goal then will define how you design your lessons and activities. Based on goals, then you would design assessments. So how are you going to be really measuring an individual's progress? And obviously that comes directly from your goal. So for example, if we have a student whose goal is to just improve their physical fitness, are we measuring them based on their ability to win a tournament? Probably not, if that's not what their purpose is. So maybe a different way of measuring their improvement is, do they come to class regularly? If we're talking about if the goal is to learn a specific kata, are we breaking it down into pieces? Is the individual learning new parts? Are they consistently advancing on those? And obviously, if an individual's interest is to become like a Paralympic athlete, then we have to start thinking, okay, are they regularly competing? Are they winning tournaments? So again, this all boils down to, are we assessing them based on what their end goal is? And obviously, one assessment does not fit all individuals. So we really shouldn't be looking at, especially in the martial arts, if we're looking at promotions of a particular type, if your martial art uses belt promotions, are we looking at the belt promotions according to that individual making progress for their own individual needs, for their own individual purposes? So we've talked about goals and assessments. Now we have to look into, we've got the end goal. We know how we're going to measure that end goal. So what are the methods that we're going to use to teach them? And what are the materials that we're going to use to teach them? So teaching methods obviously must help each individual reach their goal. And for example, we can think about partnering advanced students with more beginner students. We can consider how movements will vary based on different body types. So that's something when you're teaching a method of doing a technique, think of how you're going to adapt that for the student and their range of mobility. And consider the multiple means of representation that we spoke about early. How are you explaining? What is your method for teaching? Are you demonstrating a technique silently? Not going to be useful for a student maybe with autism or a student with a visual impairment. So we have to consider that method that we're using to teach. And finally, the materials also must be accessible. What materials are we using? Do we have different sizes and different sizes and weights? So if we're practicing a martial art that uses a weapon, for example, do we have weapons that have different weights to match the needs of, for example, children to adults? Do we have different color contrasts for students who might have low vision? And do we have lights or beepers that have, for example, lights or sounds to help people with hearing impairments or people with visual impairments to hear and see when, time has run out on a round, when a match might be over, etc. So finally, I just want to go over some extra considerations. So as an instructor, as a coach, when we come across students who move differently and who have different needs, this is a great opportunity for us to learn as well. It teaches us more about the body. People who move differently, who have different biomechanics, can help us as instructors, as coaches, learn more about the martial art itself and to learn more about the body. I don't know how many times I've been in a situation in Judo or in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu where an instructor or coach will say, this person does this differently because they're shorter, taller, stronger, weaker. And it can, having that knowledge can help us become better teachers for other people. And similarly, explaining things an alternative way helps us, again, kind of start to learn more about how a technique works, how a particular martial art functions, how a movement is. The role of an instructor, and this is the point that I really want to hammer home, the role of the instructor does not stop at simply teaching. The role of the instructor is really about making sure that all your students are engaged. So oftentimes when we see students with disabilities, or even sometimes when we have new students, female students, we'll see them sitting off on the edge because they don't know necessarily how to incorporate themselves into class, or that perhaps nobody in the class has been welcoming. There's a whole number of reasons. For people with disabilities, it can be that other students are uncomfortable, or not even necessarily uncomfortable, but just don't know how to approach them. They don't know what their limitations are. So oftentimes we'll see students with disabilities seated at the edge of the class, or new female students, especially in the case of like a grappling martial art. There have been many cases where I've seen where female students will be sitting at the edge. As an instructor, part of your role is to make sure that those students are engaged. And one potential strategy is to partner those students with more of your senior members, of your advanced students, students who you trust, who, you know, when other students see, hey, you know, that new kid, that new student is working with, you know, the brown belt in the class, or is working with the high ranked student in the class, that's going to make them more comfortable to approach that student as well. So we're leading by example here. And finally, make sure that your environment is welcoming to everyone. When we're thinking about your environment, are there shoes in the middle of the pathway? Is there really loud music? Are the bathrooms clean? You know, these things can be really distracting and or dangerous for, you know, if we've got shoes in the middle of the pathway, that can be dangerous for somebody who has mobility impairments or is blind and might trip over them. Okay, if we have really loud music playing, which is really typical at a lot of gyms, because it motivates us, right? It gets our adrenaline going. The problem with that, though, is if you have students who rely on their hearing in order to navigate an environment, that really loud music can be, it can be distracting, it can be dangerous. Or if we have students, for example, with autism, really loud music can be painful. It can be a problem. You know, it can make it a really uncomfortable environment to train in. So just consider, you know, we want to keep our spaces clear, make sure there's a good pathway for people to walk through, make sure that our music it's perfectly fine to have music, but make sure that it's low, that it's not overly loud and distracting, and make sure that we have like a nice and clean space for people to change in, that it's a safe environment. Okay, that is all I have to share as far as UDL specifically.
Thank you very much, Nick, for that's fantastic information. Some really, really great considerations in there for everybody. And I'm sure they were of benefit to all of our attendees in this webinar. And I'm conscious of the time, so we're coming close to the edge of this webinar, but I want to make you all aware that both Nick and Yumi are also going to be available. They'll be on the panel for a Q&A session as part of this series. That Q&A session will be on Tuesday, July 27th. The time is still to be confirmed, but if you can check, you can find the schedule, and we'll also be sharing information with each of you who have attended the session. We'll be sharing through our own channels as well. I really want to deeply offer gratitude to both Yumi and Nick for your valuable insights into the conversation. You both shared such rich knowledge and your expertise, and it's really interesting to hear, you know, about the field of adaptive physical activity, and then universal design for learning, and how they actually merge quite well together. So we've shared a couple of resources as well in the chat. So I shared a resource there. There's a link to a really good book on universal design for learning and physical education. There's also a link to a really great video, which actually we'll send out in the follow-up email, maybe tomorrow or so. We'll also be following up with the recording of this session. And I'd also like to take a few moments to thank all of you, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording, and deep gratitude to each of you, and also to UNESCO ICM, Daeong Lee, her colleagues there, and all of you on the MARI program. And we truly look forward to being with you all again online. And thank you very much for your time and for being with us here today.